Hello, my name is Peter, and today I'll be talking to you about the criminal risk assessment algorithms used in the U.S. criminal justice system. So, the question that you should be asking is, how are the risk assessment tools used in the U.S.? So, in this video, we're going to talk about what they are. We're going to introduce them to you. We're going to tell you the good that they do, the bad that they do, and the social impact for what happens when these tools are used. So, what is a criminal risk assessment tool? They're designed to predict a defendant's future risk of misconduct, and then they'll be placed on a scale from low to high or 0 to 10. So essentially, each time a risk assessment tool is used in the courts, it'll be used for different objects or different assessments. So maybe for bail, they will see what's the risk of you running after you're posting bail. And the tool will then give you a score from 0 to 10. And from there, the judge will then be able to make a decision on whether or not they can grant you bail or just send you to prison and hold you until your trial date. So how does it predict these outcomes? It uses a number of different demographic factors, socioeconomic status, family background, neighborhood crime, so the area that you live in, what's the crime rate around there, your employment status, age, gender, and race. So where is it used? It's actually used all across the United States at every level of the judicial system. So it's in the counties, state, and federal system. Depending on what type of trial they're having or what the judge is presiding over, they have a different version that they use to help conduct these scores. But generally, it's one system, and that's the COMPAS system, which is the most used and most ubiquitous within the United States. So what's the good that these algorithms do? A big thing that people wanted to avoid were bias and agendas. Oftentimes, when judges make sentences, grant bail, or deny bail, they do it at their leisure. You really can't question a judge or how they made these decisions when they make them. So because of this, there's really no way to ever tell if a judge is racist, if the judge just doesn't like a person, if a crime that a person is accused of committing rubs the judge the wrong way, he may give them an extended sentence or something similar to that nature. So there will never actually be any paper trail where someone can say, well, you gave this defendant 10 years when the risk assessment algorithm said they really only need 3 years plus probation or something like that. A big example for why something like this would be needed would be for the Kid for Cash scandal. A couple of years back in Pennsylvania, 2 judges were selling out prison sentences to kids for kickbacks and other monetary incentives. So what they would do is they would take kids accused of crimes, whether they were guilty or not, and then they would sentence them to juvenile hall. So that kind of leads into a sense of transparency because these decisions they make are life-altering. Some of those kids took their own lives. They were in the detention centers for so long. So these algorithms allow you to be able to take a look at how these judges are sentencing people. And generally, maybe you could be able to get a sense if something is going wrong. If the algorithm is telling them 5 years and they're giving them 10. This way, people can then be able to say, hey, maybe we should look into this. It also lifts a number of burdens from the judges because even though judges that weren't corrupt would also have to look through a number of different demographics, a number of different factors on whether whether the person would reoffend, on whether or not they would be destroying this person's family, if the sentence was too harsh, maybe people would accuse them of racial bias. These algorithms kind of alleviated all of that from the judge because they can always say, well, we were just following the algorithm. So a number of mathematical regularities went into this. The idea was that the algorithm should always ignore race and gender when giving sentences. And once again, this was to reduce prejudices while giving out these sentences, because as we know from the past, some judges weren't exactly without prejudice themselves. And so the idea was that they wanted the judges and the courtrooms to be as impartial as possible, using only the facts. So the idea was that ignoring these factors, they would allow judges and courtrooms to be considered as impartial as possible, while also keeping small time offenders out of jail. Because the idea was that when these were introduced, they could reduce as many people in jail and just give them probation based on the scale number they were given. The issues with the is a big reliance on historical data. So it's a lot of mistakes from the past, wrong arrest, would then be used and placed into the system, along with the algorithm's use of statistical methods of computation to derive correlations between large data sets, but never causality. So essentially, the large amount of data being placed in that's how the computer AI algorithm was then deriving all types of decisions, but never taking into subsequent factors that may or come with it. So take high crime in an area does not mean that people living in that area are more likely to commit crimes. That just means there is a number of more people committing crimes in that area. But the algorithm will then take that, look at it, and say, well, because there is high crime in this area, this person will probably then commit more crimes. And so placing that in there does kind of place the defendants in a bad position, because even though their chances at recidivism is low, they are then looking at longer sentences just because of the area they live. The algorithm is actually very highly dependent on what's fed to them during their learning phase. Scientists want to evaluate the data being used, but they can't. So what this means is that a lot of the time during the initial setup, during the initial learning phase for the algorithm, the data that's being fed to it isn't trained. It's not used to sort out good or bad data. It just takes in what it's given. And the problem is that the COMPAS algorithm, or the COMPAS risk assessment algorithm program, is a private program, meaning that people can't go in and evaluate the algorithm it's using, which is a big cause of concern, because if you don't know how this algorithm is pumping out its suggestions, how can you know that it's being accurate? All they can really say is that the initial data placed in during the learning phase is used, and some of that data is just bad data. And because of this, the algorithm has been shown a number of times to be unreliable at predicting violent crimes and who would reoffend. So say someone got picked up for shoplifting, they could be given a score of 8 based on a number of other factors, while someone who's been picked up and arrested for a violent crime like domestic abuse will be given a lower score because they live in a low violent area, along with a number of other demographics that may be that they're richer. 47.7% of certain racial populations that the algorithm evaluated as low risk offenders did not reoffend, and about 50% of racial minorities that was evaluated as high risk of offending did not actually reoffend. Another big issue with the algorithms used is that many judges are not trained on how to use these programs. Defendants are not able to review their score, and the proprietary nature of the software stops independent review. So this kind of comes back to transparency, where it's now become an issue because judges who are not trained on how to use this risk assessment program may or may not be able to make good on the entire nature of the program. The social impact of the algorithm kind of comes from a number of cases, one being Loomis versus Wisconsin. It was the challenge number one, violation to the defendant's due process because it prevents the defendant to challenge the tool's validity. Challenge number one is violation to the defendant's due process because it uses gender or race. So essentially, the tool itself was not the defendant sued after being convicted because it prevents them from being able to check why they were given these sentences. Due process is a right granted to all American citizens, but if you're unable to see why you're being given your sentence or seeing the information being placed against you that could be giving you a harsher sentence, it's kind of impedes this right. Statistics show that the COMPAS system evenly predicts reoffending solely based on gender. However, women are classified as high risk reoffenders 47.5% of the time. On the other hand, men are reclassified as high risk reoffenders at 61.2%. So once again, it kind of creates a bias. Same with younger people who are likely to be considered high risk at 58% of the time. And so it also gives harsher sentences to minorities. So once again, the risk assessment tool delivers an unequal results because it fails to consider cultural differences. So a large amount of data comes from whites that will lead to inaccurate predictions for minorities. Essentially, African American males are often given higher sentences as compared to Caucasian males. And it's the same for African American females who are often given higher sentences as opposed to, once again, white women. As the case may be, it kind of tends to be Black and Latino men and women are given harsher sentences based from the algorithm, especially if, once again, if they're younger. He was denied probation and he was given an 11-year sentence, which consisted of about 6 years in prison and 5 years of supervision. And this was because he was once again determined to be high risk for reoffending, even though he didn't actually commit the crimes. There are de facto things that are used in determining or are seen that kind of mold the algorithm. The racial wealth gap. So once again, people with higher socioeconomic statuses are given lighter sentences, and the median white household wealth for a white household is around $111,146 per year, whereas the median wealth for a Hispanic household is $8,348, and Black households is $7,113. This data is a bit localized and it doesn't take into account the overall infrastructure of the country, but in certain areas where this was taken, it once again creates a harsher sentencing because people with higher median wealth are often given lighter sentences. Higher crimes in urban neighborhoods, which means more policing. So generally this isn't within cities, so you can actually take Atlanta, for example. There's higher crime rates in urban neighborhoods. There's actually higher over-policing within the actual urban center of Atlanta. And so if you're arrested out there, they still use the COMPAS algorithms in Georgia courts. So it'll actually be counted against you for living in that particular area. So the problem with this is that it's now pushing inequality in America. It's reduced high-risk estimates for subgroups who are disproportionately incarcerated. So African Americans are also, because of over-policing, are already over-policed and over-arrested. So this algorithm now has given a way to keep them in jail while also reducing the chance of parole, bail, and just overall fairness, because if they're in jail, they then lose their job even if they didn't commit the crime. The algorithm will say, well, we believe you're a high risk person, and so then they would have to lose their job, which then could affect their family, especially if they're the sole provider for it. And so this concludes our risk algorithm tools, and thank you.